Today's scripture is from Matthew 21, verses 33 to 41, and it's entitled, The Parable of the Tenants. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, This is the heir. Come, let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will bring those wretches to a wretched end, they replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time.
All right, I'll start again. Good morning to you all, and compliments of the new year. This is my first service or sermon here in 2022, and I'm so happy to be here. I love telling the story of the one who loved us so much, more than we can even ever love each other. I love telling that story because it really satisfies my soul. I hope you also love listening to this story. I would also want to thank the Bible reader, Joy. You did so well. Thank you so much. I really moved with the story as you read it through. And I would also want to appreciate and thank you guys for coming this morning. On a cold morning, I never realized it was cold until I walked from the car park to the sanctuary here. Because the car was parked in the garage, it was warm in the house, just got into the car, drove here, I never felt it was cold outside. But I thank God you guys braved that chilly weather to come here this morning. Now I have a story. Like always, I love telling this story. I'm quite sure we're all listening very attentively as the story I'm going to reflect on this morning was being read. And now, I'm inviting you to picture this scenario with me. When you think of a company or any organization per se, what is the difference between a manager and an owner or the proprietor? What is the difference between the two? What is the difference between a manager and the proprietor of that business? Well, I ask this question with no intention to lead a discussion on this topic at all. I know and I acknowledge that amongst us today, we have people who are far more knowledgeable on this topic than I am. But in my research, I learned that it actually takes a year in the second year of law school at the doctoral level to cover this topic I'm going to discuss this morning. So I'm going to be very complicated this morning. But it suffices to say that an owner physically owns the business, and he may or may not work in the business. Whereas a manager is an employee of that business, and he works for the owner of the business. Way back when I was still at school, after giving such a sort of like a grounding, my fellow students would clap hands for me. Now, if I were to be a bit sophisticated, I would say the owner of the business has the right and responsibilities of selecting, hiring, directing, and even firing the manager who works under a fiduciary duty to the owner. Now, in simple language, that is simple language for church people like me and you, a fiduciary duty is one of absolute trust and responsibility to use every lawful efforts to further the owner's interest without involving the personal interest of the manager. Now, there are also instances when one can also be a manager of the business as well as the owner of the business. In this case, the owner holds a job in the organization as well as hold controlling ownership of the enterprise. Well, enough of that business class for today. Let's get back to our text, to our subject for reflection today. We are going through a sermon series, Christo Currency. Christo Currency. For some of us who could quickly discern, derived just a juxtaposition of cryptocurrency. Then we have Christo Currency. This sermon series is inviting us to relate to God in such a way that we know who we are to God and who God is to us. The sermon series is inviting us to take a closer look of how we are relating to God, maybe in comparison to how, as employees in an organization, relate to the owner of the organization. There are instances where, as employees, you may tend to forget that you are an employee and want to act like you are the owner of the business. And that normally doesn't cause any problem, only until you overstep what your responsibilities and accountabilities are in that business. Then you may have challenges with the owner of the business. But as long as it works okay, everything is okay as it is. Now, I have a couple of questions for us to ponder on at this moment in my sermon. Are there any areas of your life in which you have really struggled to acknowledge God as the owner? Are there any areas of your life in which you have really struggled to acknowledge God as the owner, where you feel you are the sole proprietor or the manager of your life, or at least both the manager and the owner of that area of your life? And the second question would be, in what areas of your life could you hand over more ownership to God? What areas of your life would you acknowledge God as the owner, and you take your rightful position as just a manager, entrusted and endowed with that responsibility by God? Areas where you would need to submit more to God. Thank you so much, Grace Notes, for beautiful song. So my wife often complains that I don't listen to her. This other day, she looked at me straight into the eyes and said, "Are you paying attention to me?" That was before she said anything. Are you paying attention to me? And she even went on to say, I don't feel like you are listening. And I thought, what a weird way of starting a conversation. So listening is a critical life skill. Listening is a critical life skill. Jesus opened this parable we read this morning. He opened by saying, he started so unusually. He said, listen to another parable. Underscore the word listen. He said, listen to another parable. To me, I want to believe Jesus was saying only those who were listening and who were of right disposition of the heart could perceive what he was about to say. So my brothers and sisters, this morning, listen. Please. Listen. Listen. I will invite you to quickly jump on to verses 38 to 41. Just as a reminder, verses 38 to verse 41 of Matthew chapter 21 read, but when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, this is the heir. Let's kill him and take his inheritance. So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? And they replied, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end. They replied, and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time. Now, if you are listening to the parable, you would have to ask, if they had killed the first servants, why would the owner send his son? If the owner had realized that these guys had killed all the other servants that he had sent, why would he go on and send his only son? Why would the owner do this? Why send the most precious person to an extremely dangerous situation? Why? Would you do that? That's a very important question with an important answer, which Jesus provided in verse 37 of the same text. And the text reads on verse 37, finally, he sent his son to them. And he said, probably they will respect my son. Maybe they will respect my son. In this parable, Matthew tells us that everyone, including Jesus' enemies, understood exactly what Jesus meant by this parable. Just like us, I think as we read through the parable, we could also capture the message of the parable. One may be tempted to think the owner of this vineyard was thick in the head to risk and send his only son where others had already been killed. What's so special about his son? But maybe we may want to see the owner of the vineyard as not being thick in the head, but thick in the heart. He still believed these tenants will have a soft heart and respect his son and remember who they are in this vineyard and who this son is as regards that vineyard. In this parable, everybody, particularly the religious leaders who were listening, they were a bit on the edge because they see Jesus as a clear threat to their establishment. There are times when you really become a bit tense because you can discern that here I'm now being challenged to think and do otherwise. And that's exactly what these Pharisees and these Sadducees who were listening to Jesus felt at that particular moment. Personally, I love parables. I see them as some form of little beneath the surface inspection into my heart. They help me understand what is going on in my heart, as well as in the hearts of others, as we wrestle with the authority of God in our lives. Now, if you have ever managed an apartment building or own a rental house, you might know about this phrase, wicked tenants. Wicked tenants, I hope you have never experienced this, but wicked tenants move in, but they won't move out. They live in your apartment, but refuse to pay the rent. Sometimes they poke holes in the walls and stuff up the plumbing system. And they paint the bedroom purple. Does that sound familiar? Now, in our parable today, the wicked tenants were even worse. They not only refused to honor their obligations, but actually killed the legal heir to the property they leased. The landowner, as you can guess by now, in this parable, is God. And the landowner's son, as you can probably guess already, is his son, Jesus Christ. There are people here and out there in the world who are tempted to give God the short end of the stick or the scraps in their lives. They have since assumed the role of owner or owner manager as regards the resources they possess or they were entrusted with. And in their lives, God is completely out of the matrix. Maybe in this parable, Jesus seeks to remind us that God owns everything we claim to be ours. And by his grace, he appointed human beings as managers of God's resources. Actually, in Psalm chapter 24, verse 1, the psalmist rightfully proclaims, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it belongs to God." God appointed us as managers of all areas of our lives, not just our possessions, but our faith as well, our time, our talents, our relationships, and the entire environment. So as we go through this sermon, I invite us to see ourselves as managers, and the owner still expects us to account for it. Not only in terms of dollar signs, God also endowed you with that gift of faith, exercising your faith. God gave us time. Our time here on earth is not infinite. Within that time that God has endowed us with, we need to account to God for our time. God endowed us with talents. God endowed us with relationships. How do you relate to your fellow Christian? How do you relate to your brother, sister, everybody around you? How do you relate to people who are different from you? And God entrusted us with his environment. How are we relating to the environment? We are appointed as managers, and God expects us to be accountable to God as regards everything that surrounds your life. And so many a time, we have forgotten that we are just managers. We have got to the extent of wanting to be the owners. And each time Jesus reminds us that you are just managers, we go ahead and kill him. We kill him because we feel challenged and threatened. Probably the day that you refuse to hear what God is telling you right now is the time that you are killing his son and wanting to assume that responsibility over what God has endowed in you. We have all been given vineyards. We all do have vineyards. And I'm appealing and proclaiming this before everyone in this congregation. Everyone, including you, we have all been given vineyards. These may be people, these may be relationships, circumstances, resources, may they be even financial resources, and events of our lives that God has entrusted to our care. That means our spouse, our marriages, children, family, our work, and our church, our daily decisions and choices, our hopes, our dreams and concerns are the vineyards in which we are to reveal the presence of God in our lives. Friends, we are tenants in God's vineyard, of blessings. If we will honor God through these blessings, God will bless us mightily in such a way that will become more than just tenants in his vineyard. We become heirs to God's promise through Christ in abundant life and blessings to us. Amen.